Lila Harlan stepped into the glass lobby of the headquarters wearing a dark Armani suit that felt like armor. She carried no employee badge and no plastic lanyard. The security guard moved to block her path, but when he met her eyes, he simply stepped aside without a word. Some time ago, she had left this building with her life packed into a cardboard box. Today she was back, and she was not here to ask for her old job. The air in the glass conference room was thick with the scent of expensive espresso and the low hum of high-end servers. Julian Langford stood at the front, his posture sharp, presenting quarterly growth metrics to a large room of employees. Everyone listened in silence because Julian did not simply run the company, he ruled it with a stopwatch. Lila sat in the back row, her laptop open, her mind moving between the complex code on her screen and the baby monitor hidden in her lap. The nanny had canceled on the most important morning of the fiscal year. The meeting was being streamed live, which only made the pressure heavier. Julian was midway through a slide on peak efficiency when a sharp, piercing cry cut through the professional atmosphere like a blade. It was her infant daughter screaming from the makeshift nursery Lila had set up in the tiny break room next door. The sound echoed off the minimalist walls, turning every head toward the back where Lila sat frozen. Julian stopped speaking mid-sentence, his eyes narrowed as he scanned the crowd until they landed on her pale, panicked face. The silence that followed was worse than the crying, a heavy, judgmental vacuum that made her heartbeat sound like a drum in her ears. He did not look annoyed. He looked disgusted, the way a scientist might regard a contaminated sample in a sterile lab. "Do you really think this is a daycare center?" he asked, his voice cold. "Or a high-stakes technology firm competing for global dominance?" But Julian did not simply ask her to leave the room. He decided to make her an example. He walked slowly toward her, expensive leather shoes clicking on the polished floor while every pair of eyes watched. He leaned over her desk, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried farther than a shout in the stillness. "You are a talented engineer, Lila, but you are also a persistent glitch in the operating system of this company. How many times have we adjusted your schedule only for your personal life to interfere with our collective march toward progress?" He turned to the entire room, spreading his arms as if performing a tragedy. "This is what happens when we prioritize sentimentality over the cold, hard metrics of success that built this skyscraper. We cannot afford to carry the weight of someone who is only half invested in the vision we are trying to create." Lila did not defend herself, even though she had worked late into the night through recent weeks, even though she had finished critical code migrations ahead of schedule while holding a feverish child. She simply closed her laptop with a soft click and stood, her spine straighter than anyone expected from a woman being publicly dismantled. Julian waved a dismissive hand toward the door without even looking at her as he returned to his podium. "Pack your things by noon. We are officially deleting the system error from the payroll before the next sprint begins." A few people looked away in shame, but most watched, paralyzed by the specific cruelty of a man who equated human existence with a line of code. Lila walked to her cubicle in the corner, the one decorated with a single framed photo of her daughter and a stack of technical manuals. She found a discarded cardboard box near the recycling bin and began filling it, one slow item at a time. The office hummed on around her, the corporate machine already moving forward as if she had never occupied that space. She picked up the box, tucked her crying child against her chest, and walked toward the elevator without looking back. Behind her, Julian's voice rose again, talking about the future of the company and the need for absolute, unwavering dedication. He was already laughing at a joke about cleaning house, and the sound of forced chuckles followed her out. Lila walked out of the headquarters that day, but she left her old self somewhere inside that cardboard box. She sat on the edge of her bed in a cramped apartment later that evening. Streetlights flickered through thin curtains. In the crib, her daughter Sophie breathed with a soft, rhythmic cadence. The room felt smaller tonight, as if the walls were closing in. Every shadow seemed to mock the box sitting on the kitchen counter. How could an entire career fit into such a small, flimsy piece of cardboard? She opened her banking app and stared at the glowing screen. The number reflected back was barely enough to cover the next few days. Rent was due soon. Sophie's next pediatric visit was approaching. This city did not care about stories or sleepless nights. It only cared about the ability to pay for the privilege of existing. A cold sweat prickled at the back of her neck. Why did being a mother feel like a liability in this modern world? But fear can only paralyze you if you let it. Lila looked at her daughter's tiny sleeping hand curled into a fist and realized that crying was a luxury she could no longer afford. Tears would not pay for medicine or heat. She needed a plan stronger than Julian's arrogance. She walked to the kitchen, cleared a space beside the baby bottles, and opened her old laptop. The fan whirred like a small, determined engine. Knowledge was the only thing Julian could not take from her that morning. He could take her salary, her desk, and her professional reputation, but he could not take the mind that had built his most successful features. She opened a blank document and titled it, "The Path Back." She would learn the skills that were shaping the future. Artificial intelligence, deep learning, the complex architecture of what came next. She did not need a fancy office or a corporate title. She needed a quiet room and the iron will of a mother. The public library became her daily sanctuary. She arrived each morning pushing Sophie in a stroller, carrying heavy stacks of borrowed textbooks on linear algebra and advanced probability. She no longer had a high-end office with a view, only a scratched wooden table in the back corner where morning light touched the floor. She opened her laptop and began dissecting the structures of neural networks, her tired eyes burning from the screen and lack of sleep. Her days did not end when the library closed. Several evenings a week she waitressed at a local diner, carrying heavy trays and worn sneakers while memorizing Python syntax and data structures between refilling coffee for tech workers who complained about their stock options. Every tip went into a small glass jar labeled Sophie's Future, a growing symbol of her silent defiance. Symbol of her soul. She dove into big data and machine learning, teaching herself to build predictive models that could identify hidden patterns. The logic of code was beautiful because it did not care about her status as a mother or the dangerously low balance in her account. A computer does not judge you for your past. It only cares if your logic is sound and your syntax is correct. She learned to speak the language of the future, spending late hours debugging scripts while Sophie slept in the crib beside her. The weeks turned into months, her notebooks filled with diagrams, architectural charts, and the messy thoughts of a woman reconstructing her entire sense of self. She stopped seeing herself as a victim of Julian's cruelty and began seeing herself as the architect of her own return. Why should she settle for a seat at someone else's table when she finally had the tools to build a larger one? After several months, the lines of code on her screen began to make sense in a new way. She was no longer simply copying examples, she was creating original solutions. She built a prototype for a humanitarian AI project designed to help low-income families navigate the complex maze of social services. She realized that her pain gave her a perspective most engineers in their towers would never understand. She began applying for remote internships and freelance work under a carefully chosen pseudonym to avoid lingering gossip from her public termination. Each completed project was a small victory, a brick in the foundation of the person she was becoming. She was not only learning how to code, she was learning how to lead with a heart that had been broken and carefully mended. One particular week began with heavy fog that swallowed the morning sun. Lila sat at her usual scratched table, Sophie, fast asleep in the stroller beside her, a pink blanket draped over the edge. Her fingers moved across the keyboard with frantic energy. She was building an algorithmic bridge to match single parents with local resources. It was her soul in code. She had been staring at the same block of logic for hours, vision blurring as red error messages blinked on the screen. There was a recursive loop she could not break, a flaw that made her predictive model fail every time. She leaned back and rubbed her temples, feeling the weight of her own inadequacy pressing down. An older man had been sitting at the table across from her for weeks, reading the paper. He wore a faded cardigan and glasses that made his eyes look sharp. He had been watching her. Finally, he cleared his throat, a dry sound that shattered the stillness. "You're overweighting the historical income data," he said without looking up, his voice calm and authoritative. Lila jumped, heart racing. She did not know whether to feel angry at the intrusion or shocked by the insight. How could an old man in a library know anything about neural networks? She asked who he was, her voice sharp with exhaustion. He stood slowly, joints creaking. His name was Arthur Ellison, a retired venture capitalist who had helped build the foundations of the tech world long before Julian Langford existed. He pointed at a specific line of her code with a weathered finger. "Your logic is technically correct, but your perspective is far too human for the parameters of your software. You are trying to solve a human problem with a cold solution." He was not mocking her. He was mentoring her. He began to explain how she could adjust her algorithm to prioritize empathy over efficiency, a concept Julian had called a glitch. Arthur did not offer easy money. He knew money was a temporary bandage, but a real opportunity was a permanent cure. He looked at Lila's fierce face and saw potential corporate recruiters always ignored. He told her about a social project he advised, a nonprofit incubator designed for technology the market had left behind. "I don't give handouts to people who are capable of building their own kingdoms," he said with a small smile. "I am offering you an unpaid internship at this foundation, a chance to prove that your human-centric logic is the future." It was a brutal offer for a woman who could barely afford next month's rent. He was asking her to work for free while her life hung in the balance. Yet he was also offering her a seat at a table that mattered. Lila looked at Arthur, then at her daughter, then at the red error messages on her screen. She realized this was the twist she had not expected to find in the back of a library. Julian had fired her because he thought her life was a liability. Arthur was offering her a chance because he knew it was an asset. She did not ask about the lack of pay or the long hours. She simply reached out her hand and shook his, her grip firm and final. They spent the next hours reworking her plan, the Air Electric with genuine collaboration. Arthur pushed her to think bigger, to stop worrying about the past and start defining the future. She learned more in that afternoon than she had in years at her previous job. When the library lights dimmed, she packed her things, but the weight in her box felt lighter. She walked out into the evening with a clear mission and an ally who believed in her. The seasons shifted, dry heat gave way to crisp mornings. Lila no longer counted the days, she counted breakthroughs in her code. Every sunrise found her at the same scratched table. Her small apartment filled with sketches and system diagrams. She was building a digital world that did not yet exist. Focused on the intersection of advanced mathematics and human empathy, her AI model was designed for the unseen, hardworking people. It was not about squeezing profit from every vulnerable user. It was about creating a sturdy safety net for single parents. She called the project the Guardian Protocol in her private notes. The algorithm learned to recognize when a family needed help and offered smart solutions before crisis hit. Arthur taught her that true power is not about total corporate control. It is about the ability to lift other people up. Julian managed his team through fear and the constant threat of deletion. Lila wanted to lead with deep human understanding. She studied organizational psychology and human behavior patterns. She realized that a happy engineer is a productive one. Compassion was not a glitch. It was a high-performance engine for sustainable growth. Spring arrived with blooming poppies. Lila was no longer the broken woman from the cardboard box. Her voice carried a new, quiet authority. She began pitching her project to Arthur's high-level foundation partners. They did not see a single mother with a heavy burden. They saw a brilliant leader with a unique and powerful vision. In the time since that brutal morning at the company, Lila looked at her daughter, who was now walking and laughing. They were ready for the next stage. The quiet work in the library was finished. It was time for her to step back into the light. News began appearing on her feeds like cracks in a high-tech dam. The company that once claimed to own the future was struggling to maintain its present. When you treat your best engineers like replaceable parts, they eventually find a place that values their input. Former colleagues were finally speaking out about the burnout. Julian's management style was a relic. Silicon Valley was trying to outgrow. He believed in absolute surveillance and mandatory long work weeks. He saw flexibility for parents as weakness and human empathy as technical debt to be erased to us. His internal memos, leaked by a disgruntled developer, spoke of crushing competition through sheer exhaustion. But a team constantly running on empty will eventually stall. The market was punishing his arrogance in real time. Top talent was leaving for smaller, more agile startups that treated people like human beings rather than data points. Julian was losing the minds that held the keys to his most critical intellectual property. Without them, his systems were becoming bloated and impossible to maintain. He tried to double down, demanding even more hours from those who remained. Turnover hit an all-time high as the stock price began to plummet. Lila watched the collapse from her quiet table with calm, detached logic. She felt no petty happiness, only a deep professional sadness for brilliant code being ruined by short-sighted leadership. Julian's failure was not personal, it was a fundamental error in philosophy. You cannot build a sustainable future on fear and public humiliation. The most dangerous place to be is in a room where nobody is allowed to tell you the truth. Lila's own project was thriving precisely because it was built on the opposite of Julian's toxic principles. She was seeing real-world impact in the families her software helped. Her data showed that empathy was not only moral, it was a more accurate way to predict complex human outcomes. She was proving that you could be both compassionate and successful in the most competitive industry on Earth. Reports began circulating that a major AI conglomerate was looking to acquire the failing company for its patents. Julian was desperate for a bailout to save his reputation. He thought he was preparing for a standard corporate merger with gray-suited accountants. He had no idea the past was coming back to collect a very specific debt. Lila closed her laptop, her decision made, and her strategy in place. The months of quiet preparation were over. The conference room at the acquiring company was a far cry from the dusty library corner. Lila stood by floor-to-ceiling windows looking out at corporate campuses. Behind her, board members discussed their next strategic acquisition. They needed the natural language patents held by Julian's struggling firm. The CEO tapped a digital file. "We need someone who understands their core architecture better than they do," she said firmly. "Someone who can see through inflated metrics and find the real value hidden in their legacy code." She looked directly at Lila, the lead auditor who had spent recent months rewriting the foundation of ethical AI. "Do you feel prepared to lead the due diligence team for this purchase?" Lila did not hesitate. Her spine was straight, her expression unreadable. She knew every line of that code because she had written the most successful parts of it. She understood the flaws Julian had tried to hide under layers of marketing and fake projections. The board saw her as a brilliant auditor. Lila saw herself as a debt collector arriving to settle an old account. She assembled her team of specialists, people who valued accuracy over corporate ego. They would enter Julian's headquarters the next morning under strict non-disclosure. Julian, desperate for cash, had agreed to a full, unfiltered audit. He expected a team of gray-suited accountants easily impressed by his presentation. He had no idea the person leading the investigation was the woman he had once called a persistent glitch. Lila reviewed the final briefing documents as the sun set. Her armor was ready. Her mission was clear. She was not going back for a simple apology or a cheap moment of embarrassment. She was going back to determine the actual worth of a man who thought he could define her value. The lobby of the headquarters felt colder than the morning she had left it some time ago. She walked through the heavy glass doors, heels clicking with steady authority on the polished marble. The air smelled of stress and vanilla air freshener, the frantic energy of a company trying to hide its decline. She led her team toward the main conference room, the very same room where her career had once been publicly executed. Why does a place that held so much pain always seem smaller when you return with the power to change its future? Julian sat at the head of the long mahogany table, the same seat he had used to rule his kingdom. But the man in that chair was not the invincible ruler she remembered. His hair was thinner at the temples, his expensive tie was slightly crooked, his eyes were glued to a spreadsheet that clearly did not have the answers he needed. He looked like a captain waiting for a storm to sink his boat. He tapped a silver pen against the table, a nervous tick betraying his supposed composure. The heavy door opened and Lila stepped in with her team behind her. Julian looked up, his face shifting into a practiced salesman's grin that did not quite reach his anxious eyes. He saw a woman in a perfectly tailored charcoal suit, dark hair pulled back into a sharp professional bun. He saw a high-level representative of the conglomerate that held his entire future. He did not recognize the persistent glitch he had deleted. Lila sat directly across from him and placed her slim leather folio on the table with a quiet, deliberate thud. Julian began his usual routine, talking about unparalleled market potential and an aggressive roadmap for global dominance. He spoke as if mass resignations and plummeting stock price were minor technical hurdles. He was still trying to sell a beautiful dream to people who were only there to perform an autopsy on his reality. Lila stayed perfectly silent as her team began unpacking tablets and connecting to the secure servers. She watched Julian's hands, noticing the slight tremor in his fingers as he pointed at false growth projections. She was no longer the panicked, exhausted mother trying to quiet a crying baby during a public meeting. She was the one holding the stopwatch now. She opened her folio and pulled out a single sheet of paper, movement slow and controlled. Julian leaned forward, trying to read the name on her folder, but she kept it angled just out of reach. He thought he was dealing with a complete stranger, a cold professional sent to decide if his life's work was worth saving. He laughed nervously, trying to break the tension with a tired joke about the intensity of the modern tech market. Lila did not smile. She simply looked at him with an expression sharp as a surgical blade. When she finally met his eyes, his salesman grin faltered into a confused frown. He felt a flicker of something familiar in her steady gaze, a distant memory of a face he had tried to erase, but he quickly dismissed it. Surely that system error could never end up in a room of this caliber. He sat back, trying to reclaim authority, and asked where they should begin the deep dive. Lila opened her mouth to speak. The sound of her voice made the silver pen slip from Julian's fingers and hit the floor with a sharp metallic clang. He picked it up, a flush of irritation crossing his face as he tried to laugh off the awkward moment. He leaned back in his ergonomic chair, a thin layer of oily confidence returning. He adjusted his silk tie with a flourish and spread his hands across the table, as if still welcoming guests to a lavish dinner party. "We are absolutely thrilled to have you in the room today," he began, eyes scanning the silent auditors with desperate hunger for approval. He was performing a version of success that no longer existed, a ghost story told in dying corporate language. He looked directly at Lila, though her nameplate was still turned slightly away. "I must say I'm quite surprised to see such an intensive team sent for a routine patent audit. It must be quite a heavy burden for you, leading a professional team like this while managing a complicated home life." He let the sentence hang, a verbal trap designed to remind her of her supposed place. He did not wait for a response, his massive ego already moving to the next stage of his rehearsed presentation. "We value the female perspective here, even if it sometimes struggles with the high-stakes, rapid pace of real technological innovation." He laughed, a short sound that echoed uncomfortably against the glass walls. "I've seen many talented women let their professional focus drift toward nursery rhymes and pediatrician appointments when the pressure of a global software sprint becomes too much." He pulled out a leather-bound internal report and slid it across the table with dramatic flair. "Our internal metrics are perfectly sound, despite the recent noise from the lower levels of the engineering floor." He looked at her team, completely ignoring the cold, clinical way they were already tearing through his server architecture on their tablets. "I hope the audit won't be too exhausting. We can certainly slow down the technical pace if you find the depth a bit overwhelming for a morning session." He turned his narrow attention back to Lila, eyes narrowed as he tried to find a crack in her stone-cold professional armor. "You have a very serious and familiar quality about you, misled auditor. It reminds me of a former employee we had to let go last year. She had that same stubborn, unrefined energy that didn't quite fit our elite corporate standards. He shook his head with a fake theatrical sigh that lacked any real warmth. She thought being a mother was a full-time job that entitled her to special treatment in a high-level firm. He began describing the visionary leadership he had provided during the last crisis, using buzzwords that had lost meaning months ago. He spoke of hypergrowth and synergistic alignment while the room watched his actual data bleeding out on the digital monitors. He was a man drowning in his own propaganda, still convinced he was the only hero of the story. He even checked his gold watch, as if her team was wasting his valuable time. "I have a high-level board meeting at noon, so let's keep the questions simple and avoid getting bogged down in sentimental details." He took a slow sip of black coffee, eyes still wandering toward the door as if expecting a standing ovation. He was so confident in his own superiority that he had not noticed the way Lila's team was perfectly and silently synchronized in their work. They were not looking at his colorful slides, they were looking at the evidence of his professional negligence. Julian walked to the window, hands behind his back, completely unaware that his kingdom was already gone. "Success requires a specific kind of purity," he preached to the silent room, "a total detachment from the messiness of human emotion." He finished his sentence and took an arrogant sip of coffee, waiting for Lila to nod and agree with his cold corporate philosophy. Instead, she leaned forward and placed her hands flat on the mahogany table. The room became so quiet that the hum of the air conditioning sounded like a roar. Lila looked Julian directly in the eyes, her gaze sharp as a diamond. "Tell me, Julian," she said, voice dropping to a dangerous, steady level, "do you still believe that a mother is just a persistent glitch in your operating system?" Julian froze with the coffee cup halfway to his mouth, eyes widening in total confusion. He searched for the face he had tried to erase. The expensive suit and professional bun had blinded him for the last hour. But that voice was unmistakable. "Some time ago you stood right here and humiliated me in front of a large room of people," she continued. "You told me that my life was a system error that needed to be deleted." The silver pen slipped from Julian's numb fingers again and hit the floor with a sharp, metallic clang. He tried to speak, but his throat felt filled with dry sand. "Lila," he whispered, voice cracking. The board members exchanged a quick, knowing look, but remained silent. They had already seen the evidence. Now they were watching the final execution. Lila did not come back simply to remind him of his cruelty. She came back to deliver the verdict. She pulled a blue-bound folder from her folio and slid it across the table. "I wasn't just auditing your code, Julian. I was auditing your character and the toxic culture you built on a foundation of fear. This company is being acquired today because your best engineers left and your stock is worthless. The patents are the only thing left of value, and I wrote the most important ones before you fired me." She paused, letting the weight sink in. "The board has reviewed my findings on your pattern of ethical violations and administrative negligence." Lila stood, her posture straighter than any machine Julian had ever built. "The acquisition goes through at noon, but your contract is terminated as of this second. You wanted a system without glitches, Julian. Well, the system just cleared you out." Julian's face was a map of unfiltered shock. The silence in the room was no longer professional, it was clinical. He looked at his desk, his mahogany empire, and finally back at Lila. Was he waiting for her to laugh? Or for the world to simply stop spinning? Lila did not walk away immediately after delivering the final blow. She did not savor the moment with a petty smile. Instead, she reached into her slim leather folio and pulled out a small, rectangular slip of paper. It was a personal check from the foundation she had built. Julian stared at it as if it were a strange artifact. He did not understand why the woman who had just destroyed his career was offering him money. "What is this, Lila?" he managed, voice a pathetic ghost of its former self. "Is this some kind of sick joke?" His hands were shaking so hard he had to grip the edge of the table just to stay upright. Lila leaned in, her voice calm and remarkably gentle for the words she was about to say. "Do you remember Sarah from the engineering floor? The young woman who sat 3 rows behind me during that all-hands meeting some time ago?" Julian shook his head slowly, mind a chaotic blur of faces he had never bothered to learn. Why would he remember a junior developer when he was too busy worshipping his own reflection? Lila continued, tone conversational as if discussing the morning weather. "Sarah filmed you that day, Julian. She filmed every second of your speech about glitches and system errors while my daughter was crying in the next room. The room seemed to grow colder as the memory of that cruelty flooded back. She posted that video before I had even finished packing my cardboard box. Now the story takes its sharpest turn. That video changed the digital world faster than any algorithm Julian had ever designed. It did not simply go viral in the tech community, it became a global symbol of everything wrong with modern corporate culture. Tens of millions of people saw his face, his stopwatch, his silk tie, and exactly how much he hated the humanity of his own employees. Investors pulled out, talent fled, the brand became toxic overnight. But while the world was busy tearing Julian down, they were also building Lila up. Thousands of messages of support flooded her inbox from people who had experienced the same cold dismissals. Venture capitalists who valued character reached out with open checkbooks. They did not see a system error. They saw a leader who had endured the fire and emerged stronger. That viral video became the accidental pitch deck for the foundation that eventually bought his company. Lila slid the check across the table until it rested directly in front of Julian's numb fingers. That video earned my foundation millions in support and exposure, she explained, gaze steady as a surgeon's. It allowed me to hire every single engineer you drove away with your long work weeks. I consider this your acting fee, Julian. You played the villain so perfectly that you funded my entire future. Julian looked down at the amount, eyes stinging with a shame he had never felt before. He had spent his whole life trying to be the smartest person in the room, only to realize he had been a tool for someone else's success. He realized Lila was not there to hurt him. She was there to show him that he was finally and completely irrelevant to the story. How does it feel to be the person who accidentally built the throne for the woman you tried to destroy? Lila stood and adjusted her suit jacket, movements precise and full of new, authentic grace. Thank you for the push, Julian, she said, voice echoing in the sterile room one last time. I never would have found the library if you hadn't shown me the door. She did not wait for a response. She did not look back at the man who was now just a ghost in a glass building. She walked out of the conference room, leaving the check behind as final payment for a debt she no longer carried. Lila turned away from the door Julian had just used for his final exit. Her eyes scanned the room where a large group of people were still holding their breath. She did not walk toward the oversized mahogany desk or the leather throne Julian had occupied for so long. Instead, she stood right in the center of the room, on the same level as the engineers and developers who had spent months terrified of making a single mistake. The cold mechanical hum of the server room was still there, but the suffocating pressure Julian had used to rule his kingdom was beginning to evaporate. She looked at the faces of the senior developers, men and women who had not seen their families for dinner in weeks because of mandatory long work periods. She saw the exhaustion in their eyes and the slight tremor in their hands as they waited for a new commander to start barking orders about peak efficiency. I know exactly what you are thinking, Lila said, her voice warm and remarkably steady in the absolute stillness. You are wondering if the new management is just a more expensive version of the old cruelty. She paused, allowing the honesty of the moment to settle. She began to talk about the philosophy she had spent months perfecting in that quiet library corner. She spoke about the difference between a high-performance machine and a thriving community of actual human beings. Julian had viewed every one of them as a biological data point that needed to be optimized or deleted. He thought empathy was technical debt that slowed the march toward global dominance. But a company that values its stock price more than its people will always find itself bankrupt of innovation in the end. Lila did not simply give a speech about feelings. She brought a new operating system for the entire company. She announced that the company would be the first to implement the Guardian Protocol as its core organizational structure. She told the room that the era of long work weeks and public humiliation was officially and permanently over. Effective immediately, every employee would have access to flexible remote work and a mandatory 4-day work week. Success is not measured by the number of hours you spend sitting at a desk under LED lights, she said. It is measured by the quality of the life you lead when you leave this building. She looked directly at Sarah, the developer who had filmed the video that changed everything and gave her a small, knowing nod of gratitude. "We are launching an in-house childcare center on the first floor starting next month," Lila continued, voice rising with new authority. "No parent in this company will ever have to hide a baby monitor under their desk or apologize for a crying child again." The silence in the room was finally broken, not by a baby's cry, but by the sound of a large group of people exhaling at the exact same time. It was the sound of a toxic culture finally being flushed out of the system. Because Lila's message was not just about kindness, it was a masterclass in modern business logic. She explained that by treating people with dignity, they were actually creating a more resilient and powerful organization for the long term. Compassion was not a glitch. It was the ultimate insurance policy against the burnout and turnover that had almost destroyed the company. She was not only the architect of a new algorithm, she was the architect of a new way to exist in this industry. Lila stood before them as a mother, an engineer, and a leader who knew that the most valuable code in the world is the one that connects us to each other. Later, Lila walked away from the bright lights and lingering applause of the main engineering floor. She needed a moment of absolute quiet to let the reality of the day sink in. She found Sarah sitting in the back of the small, dimly lit employee break room near the servers. Sarah was holding a cold cup of tea, staring out at the parking lot with a heavy expression. Lila sat down across from her, the expensive fabric of her suit rustling in the stillness. "I never got the chance to say thank you properly," Lila began, voice soft and genuine. Sarah looked up, her face a mixture of lingering fear and sudden overwhelming relief. She had spent months wondering if she had ruined Lila's life by posting that video. She did not know if the exposure had helped or if it had simply made the pain public. "I just couldn't sit there and watch him do that to you," Sarah whispered, eyes filling. "Why do we stay silent when we see someone being treated like they don't actually matter?" Sarah explained how her hands had been shaking while she held her phone under the desk that morning. She was terrified of being caught or losing her own health insurance. But the sound of Sophie crying had triggered something deeper than her fear of a corporate boss. She saw a mother fighting for her child and a man trying to extinguish that light. Sarah had uploaded the file to a burner account, hoping someone somewhere would see the truth. She did not expect a revolution, she just wanted a single person to care. The real secret was that Sarah had almost deleted the video 3 times before finally hitting post. She was worried the world would side with Julian's cold logic about productivity and efficiency. She feared people would see Lila as the problem instead of the victim of a toxic culture. "I thought I was just throwing a stone into a very dark ocean," Sarah admitted sadly. "I didn't think the ripples would actually bring you back here today in that suit." It was the confession of a woman who did not yet know her own power. Lila reached across the small table and placed her hand over Sarah's cold, trembling fingers. "That video didn't just expose Julian," Lila said, gaze steady and full of new healing warmth. "It showed me that I wasn't alone in that room, even when it felt like I was." She explained how this global support had given her the courage to visit the library every morning. Sarah's small act of defiance had been the foundation for the foundation and the protocol. Could a short clip really be the bridge between a tragedy and a brand new beginning? They sat in the quiet break room for a long time, the weight of the past months finally lifting. Lila realized she had been carrying a version of Sarah in her mind during every late-night coding session. She was not working only for Sophie anymore. She was working for every invisible person who had ever taken a risk. "You're not a junior developer anymore," Lila said with a firm, professional smile. "I need people with your kind of courage to lead the new Ethical Eye division." The past was finally forgiven, and a new partnership was born in a quiet kitchenette. As evening settled, Lila pulled her car into the driveway of her new home. This was not the dark corner of the old apartment with flickering streetlights and the constant hum of the intersection. This was a quiet, tree-lined street where the air smelled like jasmine and fresh-cut grass instead of exhaust and desperation. She stepped out of the car, heels clicking on a clean driveway she actually owned. She adjusted her charcoal suit one last time, but the armor felt different now that the war was finally over. Why does the world look so much brighter when you are no longer fighting just to exist? She opened the front door and was immediately met by the frantic, joyful pitter-patter of tiny feet on polished hardwood. Sophie, now older and vastly more confident, came charging toward her with a gap-toothed grin that outshone any boardroom light. Lila dropped her leather folio on the hallway bench and scooped her daughter up, burying her face in the toddler's soft, sun-warmed hair. The Armani fabric was expensive and sharp, but it was nothing compared to the tactile weight of a child who was safe and healthy. This was the only metric that truly mattered in the end. Lila walked into the kitchen, a space that was large, bright, and filled with the promise of a long, peaceful dinner. She glanced at her phone on the marble counter but did not check her banking app with a knot of cold fear. The insurance was active, the bills were automated, and the jar labeled Sophie's future was no longer a desperate empty hope. It was a living reality. She remembered the nights when a very small amount was her entire world, a thin line between a home and the street. How many other mothers were currently staring at a screen and praying for a miracle they did not think would come? Lila looked at the bookshelf in the living room, where a few borrowed library books on advanced AI still sat. They were small reminders of the scratched wooden table and dusty reference section where her transformation began. Arthur's mentorship had not only given her a high-level career, it had given her back her dignity and her authentic voice. She was not simply a survivor of Julian's toxic culture. She was the person who had rebuilt it into something human. Knowledge was the primary weapon, but love was the only reason she had learned to use it so effectively. She thought about the personal check she had left on the mahogany table for Julian earlier that afternoon. It was a final, graceful closing of a chapter that had almost broken her spirit. By paying him an acting fee, she had stripped him of his power to ever be a villain in her life again. He was no longer a monster to be feared, just a man who had accidentally funded a revolution through his own short-sightedness. Why do we give so much power to people who cannot even see the value of a single human life? Lila carried Sophie to the large window that looked out over the neighborhood park in the golden hour. She watched other parents pushing strollers and children playing on the grass as evening light turned the valley to gold. For the first time in a long while, she did not feel like a glitch in a cold, unfeeling corporate system. She felt like the architect of a new world where being a mother was a strength instead of a professional liability. Her time of quiet rebuilding had been the most expensive education she had ever received. But the graduation was happening right now in this quiet room. She sat on the sofa, still holding Sophie close, and let the quiet of the house wrap around them like a warm blanket. The corporate battles and intense late-night coding sessions were finally behind her, replaced by the soft breathing of a happy child. She had returned to the place she left, but she had come back as someone the old version of herself would not have even recognized. The system error had built a masterpiece, and the primary investor was currently falling asleep in her arms. This was not just a victory over a boss. It was a victory for every person who had ever been told they did not belong. Lila Harlan's journey was not simply about a corporate acquisition or a sharp Armani suit. It was about reclaiming a soul that a cold and unfeeling world had tried to measure with a stopwatch. Julian saw a mother as a broken piece of equipment slowing down his high-speed machine. He never realized that the very thing he called a glitch was actually her greatest source of power. How many people are currently sitting in sterile offices feeling like they are just a line of code waiting to be deleted? In the fast-paced landscape of this industry, we are often taught that our value is tied directly to our business cards. We are told that being efficient is far more important than being human in the pursuit of dominance. But Lila proved that true innovation requires more than high-speed processes and complex neural networks. It requires a heart that actually understands the daily struggle of the people who will eventually use the software. If you build your empire on empathy, you are not simply creating a product. You are building a community that lasts. Some might call Lila's return a form of perfect and calculated revenge. But if you look closely at the check she left behind, you see something much more graceful than anger. Julian's own culture of fear and exhaustion was the thing that pulled the trigger on his career. Lila simply stepped into the vacuum he created with her own brand of quiet and steady competence. She showed the world that kindness is not a professional weakness in a competitive market. In fact, it is the most sustainable and powerful business strategy we have ever seen. Those months in the public library were not simply a time for learning advanced programming or AI architecture. They were a necessary period of healing and internal reconstruction for a woman who had been publicly dismantled. Lila turned her humiliation into a private masterclass in resilience and the power of grit. She realized that knowledge is the only weapon a cruel boss can never take from your hands. When you have the truth and the tools, you no longer have to beg for a seat at the table. If you are listening to this right now and you feel like a system error in someone else's narrow vision, please listen. Your personal circumstances do not define your professional ceiling. No matter what a Julian might tell you, your role as a parent or a caregiver is not a liability to your career. It is your unique data point that allows you to see the human solutions others are too blind to find. Don't let a person with a silver pen decide what you are truly worth today. True success is not found in a mahogany office or a high-level title at a global conglomerate. Lila found her true profit in the joyful pitter-patter of tiny feet on a polished hardwood floor. She returned to the place she left, but she came back as a person the old version of herself would not have recognized. The system error built a masterpiece, and the primary investor was a happy child falling asleep in her arms. This was not just a victory over a boss. It was a victory for every person who had ever been told they did not belong.